I remember the first time that I moved away from my home and into a dorm room to share with a roommate for a school year. I discovered that the way that we did things at home were not the only way to do things. I was used to doing things the right way, whether that was deciding on room temperature or music selections to what hours we were supposed to be keeping. My roommate had different ideas, which were just simply obviously wrong. Of course, now we were stuck living together in the same 100 square feet for an entire school year. How were we to do this when we had different ideas about how to live life at home? Opportunities for conflict are everywhere, and yes, much to our surprise, they're even in the church. From politics to families to sports rivalries, friendships in business, in churches, conflict happens. The question that I would like us to wrestle with today from the story of Joseph is, how do I live as a Christian with people with whom I disagree? So often, when we read the stories of the Old Testament, we read them to look for role models to copy. This is how I grew up reading the Old Testament. I mean, look at Abraham's willingness to step out in faith when God invites him to go on a journey with him. Or Noah, who built an ark and endured ridicule rather than being unfaithful. Moses was the greatest leader and prophet who ever lived. David was the friend of God and the model of a godly king. Yet, we also know that Noah got drunk and naked in his tent, causing the first family schism after the flood. Abraham allowed his wife to be given away in marriage twice. Moses was a murderer. So was David. The one thing that I know about reading Genesis is that the Bible does not shy away from the weaknesses and the pride and the fault of its heroes. Rather, in some odd way, it seems to revel in highlighting those weaknesses. Today, we look at the latest story from Joseph, the dreamer, the prophet, the interpreter, and savior of people during an incredible famine. Joseph has some great character traits that are worth copying, as Bruce pointed out to us last week. Don't get me wrong, he also has the same character flaws that you and I have. Many of us are familiar with Joseph's story, or at least the generalities of it. He was the favorite of his father among 12 brothers, and that favoritism caused Joseph to become arrogant. And that arrogance led to jealousy and resentment from his brothers. Brought to the breaking point of their patience, Joseph's brothers threw him in an empty well. They sold him into slavery and covered up their crimes by telling Joseph's father, Jacob, that he had been killed by a wild animal. Throughout the next 20 years, Joseph finds himself as a slave, a prisoner, forgotten and discarded. He also experiences this incredible rise to power because the miraculous hand of God rested on everything that he did, until he finds himself as second only to Pharaoh, ruling all of Egypt. He's married into Pharaoh's royal court. He has children in the Egyptian world, and he's the hero of a 7-year famine. It's during this famine that Joseph's brothers come to purchase food for their own starving families, and they find themselves bowing down to Joseph, who is unrecognizable to them as the naked slave that they sold years ago, because Joseph is surrounded by Egyptian finery and power. So begins Joseph's testing of his brothers. Now, just pause with me and imagine how this moment has played out in Joseph's imagination and dreams over the years. Do you think that Joseph imagined himself standing before his family with grace and mercy, regally forgiving them for the lost years of his abandonment, his lost family, his enslavement? I have a hard time picturing that, because I think Joseph might have been more like me. Instead, I imagine each response, each idea, each act of revenge would be planned and then replanned my plans getting massaged and honed to perfection. What would he say? What would he do? How would he make sure that they suffered as badly as he had? Now, I think that the details of this story support my theory, but we'll get to that in a moment. For now, imagine what the result of his brother's actions were on Joseph. Talk about trust issues. Imagine being confronted by them, the ones responsible for all that he had lost. No wonder he had to leave the room at one point to gather his emotions and get himself under control. Now, I've always heard that Joseph was testing his brothers to see if they'd repented of their sin against him. And there's probably a lot of truth to that. After all, if someone has broken trust with us in relatively minor ways, let alone the catastrophically disastrous ways that this story tells us about, it's natural to feel unsafe around them. We want to know if we're going to get hurt again or betrayed again, so we avoid, and when we can't avoid anymore, we test and we probe to see who these people really are. I think that there's another layer to Joseph's tests, though. Let's look at them. So first, in Genesis 37, verse 2, we read this: Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Later in verse 14, Jacob sends Joseph out again, saying, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." His brothers thought, maybe correctly, that Joseph was spying on them for his father. And so Joseph, in chapter 42, verse 9, accuses his own brothers of spying. In Genesis 39:20, we read, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were kept. Joseph also imprisons all of his brothers for 3 days in chapter 42, verse 17. And then in verse 19, we hear that he keeps Simeon bound and imprisoned indefinitely. Joseph was sold into slavery in 37, verse 28. It says this: So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Now in chapter 44, verses 6 through 10, Joseph threatens Benjamin with slavery. What does all of this tell us? It means that Joseph, in every regard, is giving as good as he got in his fight with his brothers. Now that he has the power, he's taking full advantage of it. It's natural reaction when a person has been betrayed or abandoned and is broken by that. The results in his brothers are just as predictable. Now his brothers are the ones who are falsely accused. They're being bullied by a powerful authority. They're refused the charity that they need for their families, falsely imprisoned, threatened with slavery. They've been forced to abandon yet another brother, and they've heard their father give Simeon up for dead in order to protect his new favorite son, Benjamin. We also see that their decision, made in anger and jealousy 20 years ago, has held them imprisoned and enslaved in as surely as Joseph's more literal chains have. No matter where they turn, they're being confronted with their own failure and guilt. So when Joseph says in chapter 45, verse 24, that on their way home they shouldn't argue among themselves and become afraid and agitated, there's simply no chance that they trust him enough to take him at his word. Joseph's actions, his manipulations, and his dishonesty have made them doubt Joseph's character and his intent. At least Joseph comes by this honestly. This pattern of deceit and broken trust is basically a family heirloom by this point in Genesis. Cain, Abraham, Jacob, now Joseph. And the results always mean impending disaster for the family. God has to step in consistently to rescue them. And I think that that's actually what this story is about. I get it. The Bible doesn't specifically tell us what Joseph's motivations are for these tests. But remember the great summary verse in Genesis 50 that Bruce reminded us about last week and will remind us about again next week. It says this, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." This isn't a story about Joseph's moral greatness compared to his brother's absolute moral failure. Remember, each of these brothers establishes one of the great tribes of Israel. Instead, I think that this is a story about God's ability to shape people of character out of flawed, broken, deceitful people. And God only knows why this is an important message for us to hear today as the church in 2020 Canada, in 2020 North America. While not to the same extremes, we have had plenty of opportunity to be divided as a people. In our own community here in Lethbridge, we've been divided recently over transitional housing, over a safe consumption site for addicts, over politics, over face masks, over whether to do church live and in person or virtually over video. One congregation does things this way, another congregation does things another way. Two statements that I've heard in the last week alone. The first one is this: I can't believe that Church A isn't meeting in person yet. Where's their faith? Why are they so afraid? And the second one, I can't believe that Church B is meeting in person. It's not possible for them to be doing it safely. Now I have to explain to all of my friends why Christians are so entitled and disrespectful of public health. Such statements follow the pattern of Joseph, testing and probing to see if the person that we're talking with is on our team, if they believe the same things that we do, or if they're part of the delusional other category. God, however, points us to a better way. God uses hard experiences, challenges, chaos to mold us into godly characters. We have to be able to be together, worshiping the one true God, despite thinking differently about other things. After all, Ephesians 4, verses 4-6 say this: "There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all." Instead of giving as good as we get, Christians need to be known as the people who give better than they get. How do we do this? I've got a few simple guidelines. First, I think that we need to seek to understand before we seek to be understood. This is related to an idea of positive intent, the idea that people are doing their best. Very few people set out deliberately to be destructive or harmful to another person. The other thing about this understanding is to do genuine curiosity, to ask good, honest questions. Finally, we also need to do a gut check. Remember, you're not responsible to change anybody else's mind, but you are responsible in front of God for your own heart attitude. Judge yourself according to Philippians chapter 2, verse 4, which says this: "Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others." I ask myself, am I considering how I am making others feel or act because of my decisions? Sometimes we find that we are the older brothers. We're acting with dishonesty or with malice or with manipulation. It's worth asking ourselves why we act that way. Am I feeling threatened or unsafe or angry? Am I acting with positive intent? We need to know our own hearts so that we can do as Jesus commanded us and remove the wood from our own eye before we try to help somebody else. The second thing that we need to practice is calm connection. We're not people who are allowed to simply avoid disagreement and conflict. That's not how this life works. We don't pull away, we engage, but we engage calmly. Proverbs 15 verse 1 says this, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." Let's face it, brutal honesty feels good in a fight, but I find that it's often heavy on the brutality and light on the honesty. Likewise, it can feel really good to outmaneuver, outwit, or shame and blame an opponent in order to get our preferences. But these are not godly character. Calm words, genuine questions, and actual grace with a partner, with a conversation partner instead of an opponent, these diffuse the explosiveness of conflict. Finally, the Christian life is a life of humility. The story of Joseph, it's just not about Joseph, his brilliance and wisdom and his shrewdness and cunning, his saving of people during a famine. We have to remember that God did all of those things through Joseph. Likewise, it's not our job to point out others' errors, to shame them for their stupidity or mistakes, or for having ideas that are different from ours. Our job is to be the compelling, amazing community of godly characters who give back better than we get. People are not compelled to believe in Jesus because of us and our arguments. People are compelled to follow Jesus because God acts through us. Now, we're just starting to come to grips with this pandemic thing. We could become arrogant and judgmental towards people who don't live up to our standards of personal protection equipment and personal safety in distancing or isolation. We could also become smugly arrogant, believing that this isn't a really big deal or threat, and so we look for opportunities to prove our boldness by disrespecting the boundaries that other people have put up in order to feel safe or comfortable. Friends, neither of these is godly character. Both of these responses is sinful and have no place in the Christian life. Instead, what if we were the church of ongoing meetings of characters of God? People who seek first to understand before they try to be understood, who speak calmly and gracefully rather than forcefully and manipulatively, who are humble in their approach to other people's ideas and beliefs, who believe that there is one God, one church, and that we're actually all part of the same family. We worship a God who sees the chaos, the evil, and the brokenness around us. And he works relentlessly to build creation towards his glorious end. It is his decision to work relentlessly towards that through us, his broken yet graciously being healed church. Let's do our part when we worship, when we shop, in every interaction that we have with each other. Amen.